Hello, my name's Craig Schuftan, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the future. Back in the late 90s, I would have given anything to know what art and music, especially music, were going to be like in the year 2014. And I know I wasn't alone, because the millennium was almost in sight, the year 2000, and frankly it had a lot to live up to. Because for most of the 20th century, the year 2000 had been almost synonymous with the future. The one thing meant the other. And now it was on our doorstep, it was almost there. And yet when we looked around at what was going on in music, it didn't seem too promising. There were a lot of kind of boring post-Oasis rock classicists. There were a lot of American alternative rock bands who were getting way past their sell-by date. There were a lot of boy bands and a lot of teen pop singers, lots of those blustery new metal dudes, and some pretty lazy sounding gangster rap. And we wondered, where were the bold new ideas coming from? What is the future going to sound like? Fortunately, Courtney Love was on hand to predict the future in an interview, a press conference recorded in 1998 to promote her new album, Hole's new album, Celebrity Skin. She was asked what was going to happen to rock music in the future, in the year 2000. And she explained to the journalist that pop time was circular rather than linear. It looped back on itself, which meant that young kids with guitars would eventually react against the current boring state of affairs, just as she'd done in the late 80s when hair metal was in decline, just as the first generation of punks had done in the 70s when 60s rock started to grow up and get boring. And soon enough, this whole process would start up again, just as it had before. Pop is a cycle, and she made this kind of motion with her finger. That's what it's like. That's how time works.
It's a cycle. Pop is a cycle. Think about after Appetite for Destruction or after Nevermind. It's just a cycle. Or after Nevermind the Bollocks. It's just a cycle, you guys. It's just, and when the cycle's done and all the fire's out and all the youthful fire of all the kids in the garages is out, then what happens? Manufactured sort of B-list, C-list people come along and they're told what to do and they listen. So it's okay. It'll pick up, believe me.
About 6 months later, her bass player, Melissa Auf der Mauer, used the same model to explain the fact that Guns N' Roses had suddenly become kind of cool again. In the 80s, she explained people wanted rock stars, and then they get sick of rock stars, and they wanted singers who were down to earth and realistic. And now, in 1999, they were getting bored of realism, and it stood to reason that the new thing would be rock stars. In one of my favorite books, What is History, by E.H. Carr, written in 1961, Carr says that this cyclical picture of time is characteristic of societies in decline. When things are going well, he explains, it's easy for us to believe that history is going somewhere. And when everything takes a turn for the worse, we console ourselves with this idea that everything that's happened before will happen again, or that our current misfortunes are nothing new. So, for example, during the Enlightenment era in France, which was a spectacularly confident time in human history, or in Victorian England, which in some ways was even more so, this idea of progress was seen as self-evident. You didn't need to make a case for it, you didn't need to believe in it. You could just see that the present was better than the past, and the future would probably be better than the present. Back then, in the 19th century, only eccentric weirdos like Friedrich Nietzsche entertained this idea that history was on a loop or stuck in a rut. But after Stalin and Hiroshima and Hitler, in the late 20th century, the idea that civilization was improving was much harder to believe in. In his 1972 book, In Bluebeard's Castle, the historian George Steiner observed that now, in the 1970s, for many artists and intellectuals, especially younger ones, this idea of historical progress, the idea that civilization is improving, was becoming a sad joke. And he wondered what would become of culture, of music and art in this futureless world. Steiner believed that art required what he called a gamble on transcendence, the artist's willingness to project themselves and their work into the future. And he wondered who would bother to do this in a world where no one believed in or looked forward to the future anymore. Well, this was 1972, and that same year, the answer to Steiner's question appeared on television, on BBC's Top of the Pops, in the shape of a man wearing a very nice shiny quilted jumpsuit and quite a lot of makeup, singing a song about a rock star from outer space called Starman. This was David Bowie, and David Bowie arrived on planet Earth at a crucial historical moment, I think. The moment when the last of the 20th century's utopian dreams had kind of run out. The optimism of the 1960s had soured into a more pessimistic and nostalgic mood in the 1970s. The future had turned dark for a lot of people, or even disappeared from sight. And Bowie could see all of this. He could see, the way that this great libertarian experiment of the 1960s had mellowed into a different state of mind, or a different feeling. He could detect a feeling of hedonism around. And this reminded him of the stories that he'd heard of Europe in the 1920s, especially stories of Berlin, the things he'd read in the books of Christopher Isherwood. And he could also see, the same process that Isherwood had described in his books was getting underway in America and Britain in the 1970s. That this reaction, there was a reaction against hedonism as well, which was leading people back to conservative values and even a kind of neo-fascism. And so when he went to work on creating his characters, he borrowed little bits and pieces from that era. He borrowed a little Sonia Delaunay here, or a little Eric Heckel or Hugo Ball or Marlene Dietrich there, and he dragged them into his world. He used those artists and their work as the inspiration for his costumes and performances and album covers. There were little bits of the modernist interwar avant-garde popping up on programs like Top of the Pops and Saturday Night Live. And he also saw that if he followed the direction that those artists and their work, and even the society that they lived in, had followed into the 1930s and beyond, then he could take a reasonable guess at what the 1980s might be like, which actually turned out to be pretty much right. And this process of Bowie's reminds me of another passage from E.H. Carr's book, What is History?, where he says that while history might be a procession, as some people like to imagine it, it doesn't move in a straight line. But it's not a loop either, as in Courtney Love's model. It winds around. It's like a procession that winds around the streets of a city. And because it's winding, that means it occasionally doubles back on itself, which means that sometimes 1973 might be closer to 1933 than 1963. And this was just how it seemed to Bowie in the 70s. If he predicted or anticipated the future, it was because he was prepared to see that it might be closer to the past than anyone had imagined.